Hello and welcome to this video on how to write a choral in the style of Bach. Today we will look at the choral Befiehl du deine Wege, a quite famous choral that Bach harmonized in many different versions. This specific harmonization by Bach is written in B minor, and I'll just try to recompose and to reconstruct how he might have thought and how we can learn to harmonize chorals like this one. So before I start, I'll prepare all the bars on the score paper. We are in B minor, so we need two sharps. And then I just completely write down the melody as it is given. As usual in these chorals, we have a 4-part setting with soprano, alto, tenor and bass. And the melody is in the soprano voice. And all the choral line endings are marked by fermata. Like that, it will be quite easy to define the harmonical structure of the choral by placing a cadence at each fermata. The first step is to write down all the endings of each choral line, in which key and whether it is an authentic cadence or a half cadence. Looking at a B minor scale, we find all the typical cadences for a choral in this tonality. They are shown by the chords that can be formed within the scale. Since the chord on the second degree forms a diminished chord, which is not a tonality, the possible tonalities in our example are therefore B minor, D major, E minor, F sharp minor, G major, and A major. So for the ending of the first phrase at the repetition mark, I'll choose B minor since it is the tonality of this piece, and also because it forms an octave to the melody. For the cadence before, I'll choose the tonality of D major. The F sharp is therefore the third of the chord. The third cadence can easily go to D major as well. The fourth cadence should be a half cadence in E minor because of the half step from G to F sharp in the melody. The next cadence could be in A major with C sharp as the third of the chord. As you see, the two first cadences were in the third and the first degree of B minor. Those are the most important degrees in a minor scale. And chorals in a minor tonality usually begin and end in those tonalities. In the middle of the choral, though, I tried to avoid the first degree. Therefore, I chose other degrees like the third, D major, the fourth, E minor, and the seventh degree, which is A major. Like that, I kept the tension until the end of the choral. In the end, of course, I would like to go back to B minor. But here is a special situation. The melody has a Phrygian half step to F sharp. There are several possibilities for this kind of ending. For the moment, I'll write down all three typical possibilities. D as authentic cadence to the third degree, B as authentic cadence to the first degree, and F sharp as half cadence of B minor. Let's see later what we can do about this cadence. So now that I have chosen in which keys the cadences are, I can start writing out each cadence. The voicing for a perfect authentic cadence would look like this. In each authentic cadence I write the soprano clause in one of the middle voices. Then I add a typical cadence pattern in the bass, which usually is the 4-5-1 cadence or the 5-5-1 cadence. The first cadence is an authentic cadence in D major, so I'll start writing the soprano clause in the tenor. In these chorals, it is common that the melody in the soprano has the so-called tenor clause and the tenor or alto the so-called soprano clause. To these two voices, I now add the 4-5-1 bass clause. Lastly, I add the missing alto voice by filling in all the missing notes of the chords. For the second cadence, I do exactly the same now in B minor. First, the soprano clause with an A sharp. This time, I'll do a 5-5-1 cadence. The soprano clause then forms a 4/3 suspension to the bass. Now again, I fill in all the missing notes. The last chord is missing the 5th this time. This is actually a very uncommon cadence for Bach's choral harmonizations, because here he normally tries to put a complete chord with 3rd and 5th in the end of the cadence. In the 3rd cadence, the soprano voice already has a soprano clause, so I have to go by a different approach here. And usually for this step, I leave out this kind of cadence as well as the next one, which is a half cadence. I do them when I'm writing the whole bass voice. Like that, the cadence is easier to be fit into the context. For the 5th cadence now, I'll do another 4/5/1 cadence, this time in A major, with the same technique as I used before. The last cadence I'll also leave out for later. After I know now exactly where each phrase has to go to, I can decide where I will modulate each time. Very often, there is more than only one possibility. To do so, I'll look for a melody note that is part of the dominant family. These are notes that can be seen as belonging to the dominant 7th chord. This stock of notes contains certain intervals and formations, like the diminished 5th from the leading note upwards, that belong very specifically to a certain tonality. Therefore, they are very useful for a modulation. To make it simple, at this point we can just think of the dominant 7th chord and look for a melody note that could be harmonized by it, which is the case with the 2nd, the 4th, the 5th and the 7th degree of the scale of the aimed tonality. So for example here between the D major part and the B minor 2nd part, I am looking for a note that fits the dominant of B minor, which would be an F sharp major chord. This could be already the first note of this phrase, so I decide to modulate directly after the cadence. The next phrase ends in D major again, so I'm looking for a note that fits an A major chord, the dominant of D major. This could be the C sharp, but I actually can modulate here already before quite smoothly. The next phrase ends with a half cadence in E minor. I am looking, therefore, for a B major chord. This A could be treated as the dominant 7th of this chord, which has to solve one step down as this melody does. For going to A major, in the next cadence, I'll do the same. I'll take the D as a 7th of the dominant 7th chord of A major. Later I actually will use already the D in the bar before. And since the last cadence is not decided yet, I'll leave it out once again this time. So now I will start writing the whole bass voice. For that, I will use 4 different contrapuntal models. I'll use parallel tenths as one model, then I'll use a model with altering 5ths and 3rds, then one with pairs of 6ths and 3rds, and lastly I'll use a counter movement model where the voices are exchanging their places. In the beginning I will just use parallel tenths to the upper voice. Like that, I automatically lead the bass voice to my cadence. That's easy and simple, and I'll just keep it that way. For the modulation in the next part, I already decided where it will happen, so now I'll choose to use a leading note underneath. That brings me to B minor. Afterwards, a straight line in 8th notes brings me to the cadential 5th degree that I've already written. For the next part, I'll use the model with pairs of 3rds and 6ths. It is a model that does counter movement and is very flexible to use since it always involves stepwise or thirdwise melodic movement, which is almost always the case with these choral melodies. By using this model twice, there are only 2 notes left to harmonize. The last major, 6th E C sharp, leads to the first degree of D major, and the first note of the phrase is still in B minor, so I'll choose a B here. The next part modulates to E minor, and like before, I'll use the leading note in the bass, here a D sharp. For the rest, I'll use the 3/5 model with altering fifths and thirds. The diminished fifth between D sharp and A fits perfectly into this model. By adding some diminutions, the bass becomes more fluid, since the 3/5 model generally has a quite heavy feeling to it. So far, I have already used 3 kinds of models. The 10th parallels in the beginning, then the 3/6 model in the 3rd line, and the 5/3 model in the 4th line of the choral. In every phrase, I therefore have used a different technique. Like that, the bass line gets a strong feeling of independency from the melody. It is an easy way to get a varied choral setting. For the next section, I decided to modulate already at the beginning by using the first D. Therefore, I'll put the leading note underneath that goes to the first degree of A major. Now for this next part, I'll use the 4th model I was talking about before, the voice exchanging model, where both voices are moving in contrary motion, exchanging their places. I'll do it here where I put the cross. The upper voice has the notes D, C sharp, B, so the bass will have the other way around, B, C sharp, D. For the missing note, I'll just repeat the bass note A 1 octave lower. For the last section, I will do a mix of 10th parallels and voice exchange model. Now that I have completely composed my bass, still except for the ending, I can start to fill in the alto and tenor part in the middle, by first deciding about the exact harmony, which at this point is quite easy, since already the 2 most important voices are written out. For the harmonization, I'll use a mix of the rule of the octave and the chords already suggested by the outer voices. For the ending, that I still left open, I'm going to use just all 3 chords that I've suggested, one after another. This kind of almost undecisive ending that gives an impression of searching for the right final chord is actually very common for the ending of a Phrygian choral like this one, and has a quite long tradition. In the end, now I will finally fill in the missing inner voices. As I mentioned before, this choral harmonization was actually written by Johann Sebastian Bach. I acted like I was writing it in that moment. This is an approach of thinking through the perspective of the composer himself. Of course, we will never be able to know what Bach's thoughts really were, and of course he did all those steps very fluidly and naturally. So if you really would be able to watch him writing a choral, it most likely would just look like he was writing the whole piece at once, starting with the first note and ending with the last note. This approach, though, allows us to learn from a piece by the master himself how every step could be done, and therefore how we can use it to write our own choral harmonization. While I'm finishing the choral now, please hit the like button if you enjoyed the video and subscribe to our channel. And please stay until the end of the video to listen to a recording of this choral. Thanks for watching and see you next time.